Hi, it's Rob. Welcome to the next video in the DevOps on AWS playlist, where we'll integrate a Jenkins Build Agent in an AWS CodePipeline. If you watched the prior video in the playlist on CodePipeline, you'll recall that we implemented a pipeline using an AWS CodeCommit repo, a CodeBuild project, and a CodeDeploy application. In this video, we'll replace the CodeBuild project with a Jenkins Build Agent. Before we get started, I want to mention that I currently have a pipeline provisioned which uses CodeBuild in the build stage. This is the same pipeline I used in the prior CodePipeline video in the playlist, so if you're not sure how to provision this infrastructure, feel free to pause here and watch that video, then come back and follow along. I'll provide a link to the video I'm referring to in the description below. Okay, before we start working with Jenkins, let's take a look at our current infrastructure implementation. In addition to the CodePipeline and the services which comprise it, I've provisioned an S3 artifact bucket, which, if we drill into it, see it contains a folder for our CI/CD pipeline. And if we drill into this folder, we see it also contains folders for our application artifacts, which is the code pulled from CodeCommit in the source stage, as well as a CodeBuild artifact folder, which contains the artifacts from the CodeBuild stage. Now, if we open up the application artifact folder and download the object and inspect it, we'll see it contains the source code files for the simple SpringBoot app used in the demo. Please note that this is the same code I used in the prior videos in the playlist, so I won't be walking through the code for the app in this video, but I'll provide a link in the description below to a prior video in which I gave a brief overview of the code in case you're interested. However, I will point out the build spec and app spec files and related shell scripts, since these are obviously important when it comes to CodeBuild and CodeDeploy. And when we move on to Jenkins later in the video, we'll come back and revisit these files. Now, going back to our S3 artifact bucket into the pipeline folder and then drilling into the CodeBuild artifacts, downloading this file and extracting it, we'll see that it contains the deployment artifacts for the application. And finally, jumping over to the EC2 dashboard, we'll see that I have 4 EC2 instances provisioned. If I select the first one and look at the tags, we'll see this has an environment variable of dev, and if I select another, we see it has an environment variable of prod. Now, there are 2 servers for dev and 2 servers for prod, and these are the servers that are identified using the environment variable in the deployment group. And since CodeDeploy deploys the applications to these servers, they each have the CodeDeploy agent running on them. And if we pick one and connect to it using EC2 Instance Connect, then run a service CodeDeploy agent status, we've confirmed that the CodeDeploy agent is in fact running. Additionally, if we inspect the op directory, we see a directory for the CodeDeploy agent, which if we inspect, we see a directory for the deployment root. Inspecting this folder, we see a folder for the deployment logs, and if we cat the log, we see the application start lifecycle event. Now, going back and inspecting the deployment root directory, we'll see there's a directory with the GUID for the deployment. And inspecting this directory, we see a folder for the deployment ID. And drilling into this, then into the deployment archive folder, we see our deployment artifacts. Now, this is important to understand that when it's executing the stop server and start server shell scripts, the deployment execution context is from within the deployment archive directory, as well as when accessing the deployment war file to deploy to Tomcat. Again, when we move into the Jenkins implementation, we'll come back and inspect this deployment archive directory and see the differences between the build artifacts which were deployed here when building with CodeBuild versus the build artifacts which are deployed here building with Jenkins. Okay, with an understanding of our current infrastructure and pipeline implementation, we're ready to move on to integrating a Jenkins Build Agent. So if you're watching this video, I'll assume that you're familiar with Jenkins. If not, I suggest heading over to jenkins.io and checking out the docs. Now, what we're going to do next is install Jenkins on Ubuntu, and we're going to install it on an EC2 instance. But instead of going step by step through the installation tutorial, I've provided some files and CLI commands you can use to provision the instance and associated IAM roles, policies, security groups, and ingress rules. You can find the files and commands in the GitHub repo linked in the description below. And similar to provisioning the EC2 app server instances in the prior videos in the playlist, and which are being used in this video, after configuring an IAM user on your local machine, you can simply copy and paste the commands from the README and execute them. I'll speed up that process here, wait for the server to provision, and then pick up with the tutorial. Okay, now if we jump over to the EC2 dashboard, we see we have a new EC2 instance running, which is our Jenkins server. And I'll copy the public IP, open a new tab, and hit it on port 8080. And here we see Jenkins is running and we need to unlock it. So what we'll do is copy this path, jump back over to EC2 and connect to the Jenkins server. And cat the file. Now I'll copy the initial password, jump back over to Jenkins and paste it in. Then click continue. Then on the Getting Started Customized Jenkins screen, I'll select to install the suggested plugins. Okay, while those plugins are installing, let's jump over to VS Code and take a look at the user data script for the Jenkins server. Now, this user data script is provided in the GitHub repo, and it's referenced when instantiating the Ubuntu EC2 instance for Jenkins to run on. The first thing we'll do is run an app update and then install OpenJDK11 because Jenkins runs on Java. Next, we'll get the latest version of Jenkins, then do another update, followed by the installation of Jenkins. Then when Jenkins is installed, we'll enable and start the service. And because we're building a SpringBoot Java application using Maven, we'll install Maven and then set the paths for Java Home and Maven Home. And we'll need these paths as we continue to configure Jenkins. Now let's head back over to the Jenkins server and create our user. I'll save and continue. And here's the IP and port used to access Jenkins, which we're currently running in. Then save and finish. And now we could start using Jenkins. Okay, the first thing we want to do is head over to our user profile, which for me is the Jenkins admin. Click Configure, scroll to the bottom, and set your time zone, which for me is US Eastern. Now I'll apply and save, then head back to the dashboard, click on Manage Jenkins, then select Manage Plugins, click on Available Plugins, and search for AWS CodePipeline. I'll select it, and then click Install without restart. Okay, with the CodePipeline plugin installed, I'll go back to Available Plugins and search for Maven. I'll select Maven Integration, install without restart, and with the Maven plugin installed, I'll go back to the dashboard, again select Manage Jenkins, and then go into Global Tool Configuration. Under Maven Configuration, I'll leave the defaults and then add a JDK. Here, I'll give it a name of Java Home. And the value for Java Home will be the path to my OpenJDK JVM. I'll scroll down, add Maven. Here, I'll give it a name of Maven Home. And its value will be the path to Maven. Now I'll apply and save. And now Jenkins is configured to use Java and Maven, and we can create a new item. However, before I do that, I'm going to log out, go back to EC2, and reboot the instance. And in fact, I'm going to stop the instance so we make sure it actually stops. And now I'll go ahead and restart it. Okay, with the server up and running, I'll go ahead and connect to it again. And the reason I'm doing this is I just want to jump back into VS Code for a second and show you that in the README file for the Jenkins config, I have 3 validation commands you can execute. Now, I'll copy this, jump over to the instance, and check the version of Java. Then ensure that the Jenkins service is running, and validate Maven. Now, the reason I'm showing you this is because when you initially instantiate the instance, it will take some time for Java to be installed, for Jenkins to be installed and started, and for Maven to be installed. So if you try and access your Jenkins server too soon and Jenkins doesn't load, jump into the instance using EC2 Instance Connect and just wait and make sure that you see the Java version, that the Jenkins service is running, and that Maven is installed. And then you can come back in and hit Jenkins on the server's IP port 8080. Okay, now back in Jenkins, we're finally at the point where we can create our project. So I'll go ahead and select New Item. I'll give it a name of Jenkins Project. And in this case, I'm going to select a freestyle project. Even though we have Maven installed, I'll show you how to use Maven in the freestyle project. Now I'll click OK. Then in the general configuration, I'll select execute concurrent builds if necessary. In source code management, I'll select the AWS CodePipeline. My region is US East 1. I'll leave the proxy and access credentials empty. keep the clear workspace before copying checkbox selected, and then under category, I'll select builds. Now I'll give the Jenkins provider a name of Jenkins provider, and this is important because when we go and provision the build step in CodePipeline and select Jenkins, we'll need to provide this exact provider name. For build triggers, I'll select poll SCM and add 5 stars to poll every minute. Then I'll add a build step, which will invoke the top level Maven targets. For the Maven version, I'll select Maven Home. And for goals, I'll enter clean install. And finally, in post build actions, I'll add an action for AWS CodePipeline Publisher, add an output location, and leave the values blank. Now apply and save. Now if we go back to the dashboard, we'll see our Jenkins project. If we go into it, in about a minute, we'll see a job execution. Now, this job is going to fail. And if we go into it and look at the console output, we'll see that it failed because there was no CodePipeline job when Jenkins pulled SCM. So what we're going to do now is jump back into CodePipeline and replace the current CodeBuild job with the Jenkins provider. Okay, so back in CodePipeline, what I'm going to do is edit the pipeline, then edit the build stage. I'm going to delete the CodeBuild job, then add an action group, give it a name, and the action provider is going to be add Jenkins. The input artifact is going to be the application output from the application source stage, and here we need to enter the provider name. Now, this is the provider that we used when we configured the job on Jenkins. So let's jump back over to Jenkins, and inside of our Jenkins project, I'll click Configure, scroll down to the Jenkins provider and copy this and paste it in. Then we need the server URL for the Jenkins server, and that's just out to the port. So let me copy the Jenkins project and paste it into the project name. And now for artifacts, I'll give it a name of Jenkins Build Artifact and then click Done. Now, what I need to do is edit the deploy to dev stage and select the new input artifact for the Jenkins Build Artifact. Click Done. And then do the same for the deploy to prod stage. Click Done, and save the pipeline. Now, if we jump back over to our Jenkins dashboard, remember we only have one execution of the job, which failed because there was no job in CodePipeline when Jenkins pulled SCM. So let's go back to CodePipeline, and we're going to release a change. Now, the application source stage is executing, and it's complete. And now the build stage is executing using the custom Jenkins provider. So if we jump back over to Jenkins and refresh, now we see we have a second job executing. And this time the job was successful. So let's look at the logs. And if we scroll down, we'll see that the build was successful and that the artifacts were successfully published back to the CodePipeline plugin. Now let's go back to CodePipeline. Here we see the build was successful, and now we're in the deploy to dev stage. And this deployment is going to fail. Okay, so the deployment failed. So let's view it in CodeDeploy. And if we scroll down and view the events on the failed instance deployment, we'll see that the application stop, download bundle, and before install events were successful, but it failed on the install phase. So if we click the error, we see that the error message indicates that there's no such file or directory in this deployment archive, which is the demo app.war file. So let's go back a level and go into the instance and connect to it. Then do a directory listing of the deployment route. We see the deployment ID from earlier this morning when the build was done by CodeBuild and the application was successfully deployed. And now we see a new deployment ID from the Jenkins build. Now, if I do a directory listing for the deployment archive of our earlier deployment, we see the listing of the artifacts which were deployed. However, if I do a directory listing for the new deployment ID, here we see our app.spec YAML file, but we don't see the WAR file or the scripts. And that's because the deployment of the build artifacts from Jenkins has the WAR file in the target folder, and the scripts are in the scripts folder. So what we need to do is jump back into our source code and make some changes to our app.spec YAML file. And in fact, we no longer need the build spec because we're not using CodeBuild anymore. We're using CodeDeploy. So I'll keep it in here for reference in the GitHub repo, but we won't be using it in this deployment. And the change I'm going to make is to add the full path to the demo war app file in the target folder, as well as adding the path to the scripts folder for the stop and start server scripts. I've also added permissions to the files, specifying the owner and group is the EC2 user, and I've changed the run as permissions to run as EC2 user on the server. Now, I'll go ahead and save this file, and I'll just jump into my source code application properties and change this to v2 and save it. Then jump into a terminal. I'll add the files. Commit them on version 2 and push them to CodeCommit. Now let's jump back into CodePipeline, and we see that the source stage has just finished and that the build is in progress. So if we jump over to Jenkins, we see our new build is kicked off. And if we look at the console output, we see again the build was successful, as was the publishing to the CodePipeline plugin. And if we go back to CodePipeline, we see we're now in the deploy to dev stage. And deploy to dev has succeeded, so let's jump into the details. Scroll down, and we see if we view events that all our events were successful. So let's go back a level. Select the instance, grab the IP, and load the app in the browser on 8080, and we see our version 2. So now let's go back to CodePipeline, and we'll approve the manual review. And the deploy to prod stage is in progress. And that succeeded, so let's jump into the details. grab one of the instances and its IP. And hit that in the browser. And we see our version 2 of our app has been deployed to prod as well. So that concludes this video on integrating a Jenkins Build Agent in AWS CodePipeline. If you found it useful, feel free to give it a like. And if you'd like to be notified when I add more content to the channel, please consider subscribing. Thanks for watching.